Today we're looking at the Middle Passage. Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to subscribe and take a look at the questions down in the description. So today we're looking at the Middle Passage, which was the forced journey of over 12 million enslaved Africans to the Americas. And this is a rather difficult and unpleasant topic to cover in history because it is arguably one of the worst human rights violations ever to take place, but it's important to understand these terrible events that happened in order to have a better understanding of our past and hope that we never allow something like this to happen again. It was part of the system of slavery that developed in the Americas after Europeans began to colonize North and South America. It was called the Middle Passage because it was considered to be the middle leg of the triangular trade system, which developed from the 1500s through the 1800s. Raw materials such as cotton, wood, and sugar would be loaded in ships in North America and then taken to Europe, where they would then be processed into finished products such as rum, guns, and cloth. These items would then be shipped to Western Africa and traded there for enslaved Africans, who would then be loaded onto ships and then endure the roughly 80-day journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. During the transatlantic slave trade between the years of 1525 to 1866, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forced aboard slave ships bound for the New World. Of that number, 10.7 million survived the journey, and of that number, an estimated 388,000 were taken directly to North America or the United States. Slavery existed throughout the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Almost 2 million died on the journey itself from disease, overcrowded ships, starvation, absolutely terrible conditions, and many died from suicide, preferring to jump overboard rather than be forced into a life of slavery. In fact, on many of the slave ships, there were nets that were installed around the edges of the ship to prevent anyone from jumping into the ocean. Nonetheless, death was a normal occurrence on board these ships, as so many bodies were cast into the sea that during this time period of the Atlantic slave trade, the migratory patterns of sharks in the Atlantic Ocean changed as they followed the paths of these slave ships on their journey. Words can never really express how terrible the journey was for enslaved Africans from their homeland, and it's honestly remarkable that anyone could survive such an ordeal. It started long before they were forced aboard the slave ships bound for America. Most were from Central or Western Africa. Warring tribes would sell their prisoners of war to European slave traders such as the British, Spanish, French, or Dutch. Europeans rarely were directly involved in capturing enslaved people. Kidnapping became a common practice as many Africans found that selling those people of a rival tribe or different ethnic group was very profitable. Once slaves were purchased, they were bound and forced to march hundreds of miles to the coast, where they were then placed in what became known as slave castles. These were basically warehouses where European slave traders would hold what they considered to be their merchandise until ships arrived to take their cargo to the Americas. The conditions in these slave castles was again absolutely deplorable, with disease and starvation everywhere, and it's hard to decipher the exact numbers or attain the exact numbers, but it's estimated that 800,000 enslaved people died in these slave castles before even boarding ships. When the slave ships arrived on the coast, they attempted to fit as many enslaved people as possible on the vessels. These ships were known as tight packers, with enslaved people being forced to lay down below deck with no room between them and then basically stacked. And the temperatures below deck could reach over 100 degrees. And remember, there's no bathrooms on board. People were forced to lay in their own waste, which would then contribute to the spread of diseases such as dysentery and scurvy. Enslaved people would be forced to come onto the top deck and dance as a form of exercise. Now, one thing I want you to consider when thinking about this journey is that this was not just adults that were captured and forced into slavery. There were entire families, men, women, children. Children, infants, newborns were forced to endure the Middle Passage and the horrors of slavery. There were many slave uprisings aboard these ships, but very few were successful, as you have to consider the crew of these ships were armed with guns, while the captives on board had nothing to fight with. And two, they had no navigational experience to know where they were, where to go, and so even once they took over the ship, they couldn't really get anywhere. Upon arrival in America, the enslaved people were taken off the ship and now sent to the market, as if they were simply products to be sold. Here, families would be torn apart, never to see each other again. The slave trade continued throughout the 1600s and 1700s, but in the early 1800s, many began to recognize the evils of the slave trade. In 1808, the slave trade was outlawed in the United States, but let me stress, The importation of enslaved people was outlawed, but not slavery itself. Slavery would continue for many years, and despite the fact that the importation of enslaved people was outlawed, there were still many ships smuggling enslaved people into America. In fact, one of the most famous slave uprisings took place on one of these illegal smuggling ships, the Amistad, in 1839. The enslaved people on board took over the ship, killing some of the crew. They ended up landing in America and were put on trial for murder. Their case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where former President John Quincy Adams defended them, and it was found that they were not guilty because they had been kidnapped and were being held against their will, and so they had the right to fight back, and they were actually allowed to return home to Africa. Of course, this was an extremely rare case. The overwhelming majority endured a terrible journey and a life of forced labor. As I come to an end of this episode, I feel compelled to restate that there's really no words that I can use to express the terror of the Middle Passage. It is an episode in history that no one necessarily really wants to think about or recount because of just how truly terrible it was. And I hope that this episode has given you some more knowledge into the events of the Middle Passage, and I hope that you spend some time on your own learning more about it and its significance. So with that, hopefully you learned something, and thanks for watching.